Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop,
Not international
and that's
law?
very good. I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people.
Do you feel your administration needs to abide by international law on the global stage?
Yeah, I do. I do. But it depends what your definition of international law is.
So the idea that Trump doesn't believe in international law, of course Trump believes in international law. It is on the basis of international law that the US expects Iran to comply. Look at North Korea. North Korea has been excluded from the world stage, from the international order, from global trade. North Korea has basically been excluded, exiled, shunned by the Allied states because North Korea will not cooperate, because it is under a government that will not comply with the rest of the governments that demand that it disarm, that it not be in possession of nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons development program. And because the Iranian regime was defiant and would not comply with agreements around its uranium enrichment program, it is on this basis that the US has excluded Iran from global trade, from being a participant in the international stage, in the international world order. So the idea that Trump or that the US doesn't believe in international law, if you didn't believe in international law, then you would have no right to attack a sovereign state, because whatever that sovereign state does is its own business. But the US demands, but the US demands and expects that whatever Iran does with its uranium enrichment program, when it comes to the percentage of that purification process, which is the difference between whether Iran can be considered a dangerous state or not because of how close or how far it is from being able to turn its uranium into clean nuclear weapons. Because when it does that, then it poses a real threat to the US, but also to the rest of the world. The US makes it its business to know whether Iran has that capability, and if it does, the US has intelligence agencies specifically, so does Israel, specifically for the purpose of finding that information out. And on the basis of that information, it claims the right to then attack that country, to bomb that country, to take out its nuclear sites, its weapons development programs. That is something that the US does on the assumption that Iran should abide by international law. That is the only reason why the US makes it its business to know what Iran does and doesn't do within its own country. So the fact that it had this oppressive regime, that also didn't have to be the US's business. It didn't have to be anyone's business. Instead of saying that it's Iran's business, how it governs its countries, it did not say that. What the US said was that if Iran is going to have an oppressive regime, if it is going to violate human rights within Iran, then it would be excluded from global trade. It would be sanctioned. So heavy penalties and financial sanctions, including being completely shut out from the international banking system. So Iran is then forced to trade. So it is then severely limited in its trading partners. So even though it has oil reserves, even though it has a lot of natural resources and it can trade, it can make money, it is not allowed to make its revenue from the Allied states. So US, Australia, UK, all of the Allied Western states, with the UN's bidding, with the UN's blessing, has basically entered into this one-sided contract with Iran to shun Iran or to exclude Iran from global trade, from the international agreements that allow countries to freely trade and freely pass money from one country to another, to keep those economies running. So, of course, the natural consequence of doing that has led to Iran's economy being completely crippled, completely crippled. The US still feels entitled to the oil reserves in Iran. the US will still refer to the oil reserves in Iran as the world's oil supply. So it will buy that oil, it will take that oil, it will use that oil, but it will not allow Iran to get revenue for that oil from the allied states. So Iran is then forced to trade with China, with the UAE, so with the Gulf states, and the US has no choice but to allow like a third party state, so a country like China or the Gulf states, it has no choice but to rely on these other nations or a third party to facilitate trade to be able to use that oil. So, of course, it's an expensive process, and what the US wants is compliance. It would rather that Iran complies, it would rather that Iran disarm, and it would rather that it didn't have to impose these sanctions on Iran so that it could freely take from its oil reserves and oil supply. But the reality is it can't, and it can't because Iran's regime has remained defiant. It has been a defiant regime that would not comply with the expectations of the US, of Israel, and of the Western states. So its non-adherence to international law is the reason why the US is now bombing that country, is now attacking that country. So the idea that Trump doesn't believe in international law is a joke. What Trump believes is that he or the US does not have to abide by international law when it doesn't suit him or when it doesn't suit the United States. But of course, it expects all other countries to be players, to be good and fair players in the world order.